Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today we're with Alissa Wilkinson. She has been a correspondent for Vox. She's written for Rolling Stone magazine. She has been on the juries for the Sundance Film Festival and the Hamptons International Film Festival. And she's a film critic for the New York Times. On top of all that, she has written 3 books. Her latest, just out, is We Tell Ourselves Stories, Joan Didion and the American Dream Machine, which I loved. It's a fascinating look at decades of American history through the medium of film and Joan Didion. Alissa, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to do this.
Oh, this is great to have you here. Now, I am also fascinated by your drink choice, the Gibson. Is this actually your favorite drink, or is this something you thought we'd just sort of give it a whirl today?
Oh, no, it's my favorite. I don't order it all the time because I've definitely had bartenders say, oh, yeah, we can make that. And then I see them go back behind the bar and Google the recipe. But it's always been my favorite. And in fact, these are all my favorite versions of the ingredients. So we're in great shape
we're
here.
In good shape. Okay, good.
Hendrix is my choice.
Well, it's actually pretty darn simple to make.
It is.
It's just, I don't know, like when you get to the end of it, do you actually eat the onion?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I will do so. I'm going to follow your lead on all of this.
It's a great drink. Yeah, I think it's, it's sort of like a dirty martini, but with onion instead of olive.
All right. I am, not only is it a first for the show, it's a first in my entire life, so I'm excited.
Amazing. Well,
do you put with a dirty martini, there's a little olive juice that goes in? Should I be doing that with the onion?
You can do that. Depends on how you feel about onions personally. People have feelings.
Well, I'm going to do what you do.
Okay, great. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
I'm a real believer in the martini kind of isn't too vermouthy by the end of it.
Yeah.
So you've done it correctly.
Okay, good. Yeah, I go kind of.
The joke about you should just sort of whirl it around the canister.
My dad had this old joke that I told to someone on the show, and he didn't think it was that funny. But the joke is that some guy goes in the bar and he says, don't put any vermouth in there to the bartender. Just whisper vermouth over the shaker.
Mm-hmm.
You know the joke? Yeah, so the guy makes the martini and he says, vermouth over the shaker. And he hands the drink over to the guy and he says, loudmouth. All right,
Love
a much better reaction.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. No, I will drink most kinds of martinis as long as they're made with gin, but
right, exactly. Gin.
That's the important thing.
And Hendrix is your gin.
Hendrix is my gin.
All right.
Yeah.
So is the New York Times is it, does everyone have a bottle of something in their desk drawer down below there, like the old days, or?
Not as far as I can tell. I've never been offered. I have once been offered a drink in the office, and it was somebody's celebration of closing a big issue. And other than that, not big drinkers.
I still picture it like the Mad Men days.
I know.
Where you walk in and Roger Sterling's there with a
cart coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we have a lot of seltzer.
Seltzer.
We're big seltzer drinkers.
Espresso machines.
Yes.
All
yes,
right.
we do have that.
Alissa,
wonderful.
Cheers.
Thank you. Yep, that's good. That's a good one.
It's actually really good.
Isn't it nice?
I wasn't expecting that to be.
It's a perfect with your dinner, right?
Yeah. The onion was going to get me in a different
Hendrix
way.
is kind of sweet, so you kind of get the balance of them. Yeah.
All right. I'm very happy with my drink.
Well, good. I'm glad.
So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Albany, New York.
Oh, my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
That's where my wife is from.
Oh,
Albany.
really?
Small Albany, she calls it.
Yes, that's what I also call it. Yeah. Yeah, my mom's whole side of the family still lives there, and my dad's side's from Boston, so we're Northeasterners.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And, winters are rough. She would talk about winters as a kid, and it was you end up thinking, why did anyone ever move there?
No, I know. Most of my childhood memories are shoveling snow, 17 snowstorms over my head.
Yeah.
And then I moved to the city and,
Never look back.
We've gotten snow while I've been here, but nothing like that.
Yeah, that's upstate New York is a different thing. But otherwise, upstate New York is so underrated for its beauty.
It's
the
really
drives
gorgeous.
up there, it's gorgeous. They're hiking, trails and parks. The whole
I always
state
recommend
is really great.
People take the train from Amtrak from New York City up to Montreal, which takes 12 hours, but you're going all the way up the Hudson, and then you kind of go through just the most beautiful areas you've ever seen, and then you're in Montreal.
Is there a sleeping car on it? Can you get a nice setup, or are you sort of?
I think it's usually an all-day train. I've never seen the sleeper train, but it's a really great thing for a writer, actually, because you're just on this train, beautiful scenery. It's comfy. They've got bigger seats for the long haul.
Oh, I'll put that on the list. That sounds like a nice getaway. So you went to high school there, then college. Also the Northeast?
Also there. I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is very close to where I grew up. And it's a STEM school. It's actually, fun fact, the oldest engineering school in America. And I studied computer science and IT while I was there.
Oh my gosh, and
Yes.
now you're a movie critic.
And now I'm a movie critic.
So was the movie thing in the household? Do you have siblings?
I have one brother who's almost 6 years younger than me. But no, we didn't grow up really watching movies at all. We grew up in a very conservative community, and movies were just not part of it. So we read a lot. We were book people for sure, and played music, things like that, but not really movies.
Well, that's the art. It's basically the same thing.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Theology, I've noticed, before we get into some of your process and stuff, I noticed theology is part of your study and your work. I think I have this written down. I know we've had a couple of Wikipedia type things that were not correct, but 2017, you were visiting fellow at the Anglican Ministry in Sydney, Australia?
Yeah, they call it Anglican Deaconess Ministries, which is like a very old name inherited from something. It was a fellows program for women who were scholars in mostly Australian women scholars in the Sydney area. And they had me come in and give talks about what was my latest book at that time, which was about the philosopher Charles Taylor and the apocalypse. So it was really good time. I hadn't spent that much time in Sydney before getting there. Yeah.
I have never been. I'm dying to go. It's been on
great.
our list, but it feels like you need at least 2 weeks to sort of deal with the
You very
travel.
much do. My brother currently lives in Bali and has for the past 4 years. And I just can't carve out enough time to get all the way there, over the jet lag. And then you have to turn right around and come back.
Yeah. And so theology in arts and literature, pop culture has been one of your threads. I mean, I know you're a film critic for the Times. You're seeing all sorts of stuff, but that's been one of your threads.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk Oscars just because it's so recent.
Yes.
And what are some of the main takeaways you had from the ceremony? Conan O'Brien, I thought was great.
I thought he was wonderful. I had, it was the least mad I've ever been at an Oscar ceremony since I started covering them. He was really good. And the thing I was happiest about with him was that he didn't make any jokes about how nobody had seen the movies, because it just feels like very low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And it's also not really
Particularly this
true.
year, it was sort of like...
Yeah, I mean, there's a low box office on them, but you kind of have to remember that all these movies go to streaming so fast that box office is just kind of crazy at this point. But 2 of the 10 Best Picture nominees were 2 of the biggest movies of the year.
Dune, was that?
Dune 2 and Wicked.
Okay.
And
Wicked,
Inside Out 2.
The author of the Wicked novel is coming on soon on the show.
And he's also from Albany.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
You guys are taking over.
Yes, I know. Well, kind of.
But the Best Picture winner I had not even really heard of and definitely have not seen, but I will see it now.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. I saw it at its premiere at Cannes, which is where it won the Palme d'Or, which is like the big award. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a romp and it's kind of sad, and it has a great central performance, and it's all in Brighton Beach, New York City, which is like Russian Brooklyn, down by Coney Island. So you get these real accents in that movie, which is delightful. Yeah,
I want to check it out.
But he broke a bunch of records winning that. He's the only person. Sean Baker, the director, is the only person to win 4 personal Oscars on the same night for the same movie.
I saw
ever.
a photo of him holding all 4. That must have been like dreamlike for him. I have to say I was relieved to see that Gladiator 2 did not sweep awards, because I really enjoyed the 2000 movie with Russell Crowe. This one I just thought was insanely bad. And then people were talking about Oscar nods, and I'm like, am I taking crazy pills? That was the worst movie I've ever seen. I
mean, one thing you can tell from this year's Oscars compared to like that conversation is the Academy has changed so much that they're basically unpredictable at this point. Like in the past, it would have gotten those nods, and Conclave would have won hands down. And it still, I think, probably came pretty close to winning Best Picture, but the Academy has gotten very international over the past 10 years. And so there's a wider kind of variety of tastes and interests and likes in the group.
The narrower tastes would have lent more to Gladiator 2?
Yeah. So 10 years ago, the median voter in the Academy was a 70-year-old white man living in Los Angeles County. And now it's changed quite a bit from there.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. We like Gladiator 2 when we weren't 70-year-old white men living in LA, but that was sort of the taste that ruled the Academy for a long time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
What other takeaway? I mean, it is the one thing we love to hate the most. Everyone just
Yes.
Says, oh, but then they watch it and love to talk about it for a while.
I know. I don't know why people are so hung up on the Oscars. It's like, it's like professional awards given by a professional organization to itself. And there's basically nothing else we treat that way. But I think, it's not going to be the way it is forever because they just can't make enough money off of the ceremony at this point for it to maintain itself the way it is. But we'll see how it goes in the future. But
I think they have to scale back how the whole production even comes off. Ratings are somewhat down, but they're still pretty big.
It's still a very big show, but ratings are down for everything, which means ad sales are down for everything. And that's one of the major
What's the budget
drivers.
for the ceremony?
Gosh, I don't even know. I have no idea. It's basically the driver of revenue for the Academy.
Yeah.
So they spend a lot of money on it. But I also know the Oscar hosts constantly talk about how it doesn't pay very well, and I don't think they're completely joking about that. So
you don't know what Conan makes for doing the night?
I don't. No. I wouldn't even hazard a guess.
Do you get a vote? Are you a voting member?
No, critics don't vote. No.
Okay.
No, it's purely people who've worked in the business.
I was thinking that they need a 20-year look back retroactive award. I just saw some articles saying it was talking about how Forrest Gump won Best Picture, but that year there was also Shawshank Redemption and something else, and that as these tastes age and the movies sort of age over time, you're like, boy, we really should have given it to that one, not that one.
Yeah, I mean,
they should add that as a category, like the 20-year look back.
The 20-year look back. I know that's not a bad idea. I mean, I think it's really fun to look at them because you don't just see how tastes have changed, but how where the money goes has changed too. Like,
what do you mean?
Most Hollywood money goes to mega huge productions that are designed to do well around the world, like Marvel movies, that kind of thing. And then there's independents, like Enora's budget was $6 million, which is tiny. There's not a lot in the middle right now, and we used to make mid-budget movies for adults in America in the 90s. And if you look at the movies of the 90s, they're great. But that mid-budget is a sweet spot that kind of got abandoned by the studios. I'm hoping it's coming back.
Yeah. It's just there's a producer that I've gotten to know a little bit in the last little bit was saying that exact same thing.
Yeah.
Like, you can get something made for $5 million or something made for $150 million, like a Tom Cruise thing.
Yes.
And in the middle, which is oftentimes where the best movies come from. There's almost it's very
the $40
dry.
million movie is often the one that like has some good stars in it, like had the time to make itself good, but it isn't so like it doesn't have to be so general as to please everyone in the whole world. It can be a little bit narrower, and that's usually the mark of good art, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love this sort of movie critique. I could sit back and do a whole show on
all I
on
talk
movies.
about all day.
But, I also read you wrote for RogerEbert.com.
I did. Yeah.
Is it true that Siskel and Ebert did not like each other?
That is the word on the street. Yeah.
Something was circulating on Instagram recently, and it was an old outtake of those two. And so during the outtake, they were just sniping at each other in this really nasty way.
I think that's true. My friend Matt Singer wrote a really good book about Siskel and Ebert called Opposable Thumbs that came out last year. And so there's like a big story in there, kind of about their frenemy-ship or something. But I also think if you walked into any bar where film critics are hanging out at any given time, you'd think we all hate each other. But we're actually all really good friends. That's our mode of interacting is to yell at each other about our dumb
That's why you're
taste.
critics.
That's right. That's the job.
So if you've written a review or before you've written a review, has anyone ever sort of tried to cozy up to you? Like, hey, like, and they send over like bottles of gin and things like that and try and work a good review?
It's a great question. The TV networks tend to do more of that, or they did. I think they had more money for a while. There's a pretty good divide between film studios and film
this
critics.
Drink is so good.
Isn't it good?
Like, I'm stunned at how good the Gibson is.
You're very welcome. I don't get a lot of that, but partly it's just they know I don't respond to it. You will get emails sometimes from people who want to interact about a movie or suggest an angle to you, and the Times is very stringent about independence, but I've always just made sure that there was a separation there. And I won't review a movie made by a friend for that reason. But there isn't too much of that. And certainly Disney doesn't try to pay me off or something. They don't need me, right?
But maybe they'll have some sort of event where you're invited and there's cocktails and whatever.
They do those. Yeah, they do those with people they consider to be influencers or like friendly press, you
But
know?
not an independent review at a place like
I
the
would say
Times.
legitimate journalists generally don't get invited to those. It's often like
Mm-hmm.
fan bloggers or something like that, which is a whole industry, and I respect what they're doing, but it's not
Well,
what
that's
I
why
do.
your reviews, I suppose, can have so much power. I think there was one, I don't want to skip ahead of the book just yet, but
Oh.
I think there was an example in the book that might have been Bonnie and Clyde, where it had limited distribution, was basically tanking, and then a nice review came out, I think, in the
It was
Times.
Pauline Kael in the New Yorker.
New Yorker.
And she basically saved that movie.
Breathed life,
Yeah.
so all of a sudden it got distribution and then did great.
It won like 10, it got 10 Oscar nominations or something right after it reopened.
That's
yeah.
amazing. And it had already kind of closed.
It had
before the review.
closed, yeah. I mean, opening and closing was very different in 1967 than it is today. But yeah, I mean, Warren Beatty was like basically, I guess it's over. And then Pauline Kael saw it. She loved it. Pauline Kael and Joan Didion were not even frenemies. I think they were just outright enemies.
Yeah.
But yeah, she wrote this very long piece. The New Yorker published it, and the rest, like quite literally, is history.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing. Bonnie and Clyde. It had to be Bonnie and Clyde too, by the way.
Yeah.
Like Clyde and Bonnie would not have
No,
worked.
I agree.
don't think.
I agree.
I wanted to ask you, given like the Oscars discussion and TV and film and the absence of this middle budget, big screen stuff.
Yeah.
In the early, I remember watching shows like Mad Men, 12 years ago or so, and everyone started talking about the golden age of TV, which seemed, I think people kind of pinpoint the start with The Sopranos
Yes.
in '99.
That's right.
Has it died yet?
Yes.
It's over, right? The
Well,
golden age is behind us.
You should never ask a film critic too many serious questions about TV because we get dinged sometimes for our opinions about TV. But I would say yes, it ended. And I don't know if it ended with those shows or if there was like a little kind of hanger on moment. But
Yeah.
there's that was a moment where a lot of the shows were approached, I think, with the mindset of almost a playwright. Like you watch them and every episode kind of hangs together on its own, and there's an arc, and there's this production value that's just incredible.
Yeah.
And once that formula started working, they did what the entertainment business always does, which is try to reproduce it infinitely. And there's just no way to do that. There's not enough people to watch. And on top of it, the streamers kind of took over the distribution and just have so much content that even a show that we perceive to be huge like Severance or Succession has like a fraction of the viewers that those shows would have had.
Really?
Yeah.
Severance has a fraction of what Mad Men or Breaking Bad had?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I know that to be true. And I know like Succession's numbers would shock you given how much it felt like people were talking about that show when it was on the air.
Yeah.
So that doesn't make it less good, but because it's really expensive to make a TV show, even a pretty middle
By the way, you
level
just
one.
named like the only two bright spots in recent years of TV shows. Severance and Succession, I think, are both really well done. I was, in preparing for this, I put the end date at 2019, which is a nice round number of
It's
20 years, which is Game of Thrones season 8. I
Yeah.
think that was the death knell of the golden age. That was
Yeah.
so disappointing to me because I love that show.
Yeah.
And season 7 might have been the best season, and then 8 came around. I'm like, oh my God, it's over.
Yeah, and Game of Thrones was just hilariously expensive to make. You know,
Right.
they were never going to recoup that money. So I think there have been good shows. I love the shows of Nathan Fielder, for instance.
Oh, I don't know that.
The Rehearsal, and there's, shows like that. But a lot of them are kind of niche shows that show up on HBO or something like that.
Okay.
We just don't watch network TV like we used to. And so
I never watch a network TV show.
No,
don't
I
even
mean,
know what they are. It's
they
like
still
another
get-
NCIS spinoff or something.
yeah, all of those kinds of things. But, that said, The White Lotus is like showing right
great.
now and people are really into it. So
Severance is amazing. Which you
Severance is
mentioned.
amazing. Yeah. So there's still the stuff. It's just not seen as broadly as I was trying to explain to some of my students how big it was when Friends ended.
Mm-hmm.
Just everybody remembers where they were when that finale aired, and they just can't. This isn't.
And
this doesn't-
same for Cheers, same for MASH. MASH was like, I was a little kid when that was ending, but man,
Yeah.
that was like,
In fact, I'm pretty
was
sure that
huge.
Friends and Frasier ended the same week, and I just remember
wow.
that being like a real TV
End of an
moment.
age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it felt like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be on the jury of a film festival?
So in the case of a place like Sundance, they have a number of different sections in the festival, and it's like U.S. narrative, U.S. documentary, world narrative, world documentary. There's a couple others. And they always have a couple of people who they perceive as like authorities in the field. So in my case, it was U.S. documentary. It was me and 4 documentary filmmakers who made work that was honored in at Sundance or maybe at the Oscars. And we watched all the films in the section over 10 days. So that was, I believe, 19 films the year I was there. It's gotten a little smaller since, but we watched 19 movies together. And then we got in a room with room service and wine. And for like 6 hours, we debated which movies deserved awards and which awards they deserved. Mm-hmm. And we took one break. And then at the end, you award them to the movies. And at a festival like Sundance, this really matters because for most of these filmmakers, it's their first movie, maybe their second. Mm-hmm. And getting the Sundance Award kind of means that the movie might play at additional festivals, maybe get a distributor behind it. So it feels important. At bigger festivals, it's a little different. Like at Cannes, the head of jury is like Greta Gerwig last year. So that's different. That's like an award that's nice to have, but it's not. The movie's going to have distribution either way. But yeah, and it's.
Did you largely feel good about the outcomes, or were you like this person? There's some shenanigans going on here. This person's been.
There were no shenanigans, but it was interesting to be the lone critic among filmmakers because, and other critics who've been on juries have said this too. You hear how differently the filmmakers think about the stuff they've watched, and how differently they think about what is award worthy compared to how I would think about it. And so it's actually a really good learning experience.
Is there an example of that?
I probably can't honestly say out loud.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but yeah, we have like things we're supposed to say.
Then you must say it out loud.
Certainly not on radio. But yeah, I mean, there definitely was, for instance, there was one film in particular I'm thinking of that I thought was the best, and the rest of them hated it. And there was no horse trading. I just have to let it go.
Did they all hate it for the same reason?
They didn't even get that far. They were just like, no.
No, okay.
And there were others that they loved that I was like, really? But you kind of try to craft a winner's slate that will be most beneficial to the most people and that also represents the actual quality of the films. So we gave out 6 awards to 6 different films.
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, and this, of course, throughout the arts, this all exists. For books, it's the National Book Award or the Pulitzer, and they have these same committees made up of different types of people, critics and other
authors.
Folks. So it's a common thing, and it's like, how do you work out the winners in something so subjective as art?
That's right. And it's very different from the way the Academy picks the Oscars, which is just like 10,000 people get links. And then
who are those 10,000 people?
They're people from all across the industry. So they're like 17 branches, I think I'm right, where it's like directors, actors, visual effects people, sound people. There are like producers, publicists, executives.
So everyone has some professional association with filmmaking.
Yeah, they have to have worked in the business and been invited to join by the Academy, which is a big deal for them.
And they're all like in a union, like some form
A lot of them are in unions. There's no, for instance, visual effects union, so those people are not in a union. Okay. But it is a professional organization, the way that like the Screen Actors Guild is, but that's also a union, and this is not.
Okay. Well, let's do it. So we always do a quick section on process. So for you, I'd like to get 2 angles of it. One with your reviews and also with your book. So if you sit down, the Times assigns you, we want you to review the following movie. How does that start to finish go?
So I usually know about a month ahead that I'm going to be reviewing a movie. Often it's a movie that I saw somewhere before, like at a festival or something like that. But sometimes, plenty of times it's not. So what I have is the information about the movie, the release date, and the publicist who's representing it. And I get in touch with them and I say, can I see this movie? And if I have seen the movie, but not recently, I will definitely rewatch it. So in many cases, I see it twice. And then I watch it either in a screening room. There are all these little screening rooms hidden all over the city that only critics really know about.
Yeah. So you never go into like the big AMC with a bag of popcorn and the whole
Sometimes
crowd.
I do, but it's rare. So a really big movie sometimes will screen with audience members who got like advanced tickets because they're fans or something. So I saw the one that is sticking in my mind is I saw It Ends With Us in a screening with like a bunch of fans.
So did you review that one?
I did not actually. I just wanted to make sure I saw it because I knew it was going to be big, and I'm.
You were
anyhow,
right.
I was right. But no, most of the time it's like me and 10 other people in a room. And then let's see, movies come out on Friday. We publish the reviews on Thursday. My deadline is Monday. With a few exceptions. Sometimes I have to review it that night.
So it comes out the Thursday before it releases in theaters? Or the Thursday after the Friday?
So if a movie came out this Friday, then the review would come out on Thursday.
Just before, day
Yeah,
before.
there are usually a few screenings in New York City on Thursday night for the public of a film. So we like to have the review come out then. And so, yeah, I write it.
Is there a rule on word count for your review, or it's pretty open?
Because I'm one of the two lead critics, I have a little bit of leeway. They're always kind of between...
Like Adrian Brody, you can just go on and on and on if you want to.
No, I mean, we have to literally fit it on the physical paper. This is the first publication I've written for that is like... has a paper that we have to print it onto, and so you can only go so long. Their whiz is in the print hub. I don't know how they do it. But yeah, so, we publish it Thursday online and Friday in print usually. Okay. So my cap is around 1,200. They prefer a little below that. Yeah, but it's not that hard to fill 1,200 words on a movie you really like or a movie you really have a lot to say about, maybe a movie you really hate. And for me, the goal is, what did I feel about this movie? Why did I feel that thing? And then, like, what else do I need to add to help the Times reader?
You do have sort of an arc to your reviews. Like,
very much.
The things that I...
Yeah, I think if you read me consistently, you'll start to see kind of my way of doing this, which is different from other critics, but...
Is it different from Joan Didion's way of doing it?
Yes. I don't think Joan Didion's film criticism is very good, but it also was very short. And she only had like a literal column in Vogue to write hers, and I can't even imagine writing
I didn't
that
even
length.
know. So I've learned so much about Joan Didion. There, as we mentioned, there's the Lily Analyk book, and she came on, and with your book, I knew about her novels, of course, and her essays. I did not know she did so much political or writing about film.
Yes.
Either. So
yeah, the film criticism isn't published anywhere other than in Vogue. So you have to
go to the microfiche of
you
Vogue
have to go to the thankfully it's on PDFs, because I was trying to research that part while the pandemic was on, so you couldn't physically go to the library, which is where the archive is. So I called them and I was like, how do I get into this stuff? And they said, well, there's sort of a secret electronic backdoor, and they got me in so I could see all of those reviews. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was an adventure. And of course, now you can go see it in person.
So with yours, does anyone edit your reviews, or are you final arbiter?
Oh yeah, we edit real hard. So I file. I'm a very clean and fast writer, which is a good thing to be as a newspaper writer. Yeah. But I file, and then I have a first editor who goes through it, and it's usually for like content, facts. It's hard when you're writing 3 pieces a week to get all the facts right. So they check a lot of that. Infelicities, did you say this the right way? Am I sticking to Times style, which is something I'm still getting used to. I've only been there about 1.5 years. And then after they're done with it, it goes to a second editor. And the second editor really does the copy edit to make sure everything's kind of in order and in line. And sometimes they'll query a fact, or just making sure I'm kind of on the straight and narrow. Occasionally, it will also go to the standards desk, which is where, if it's dealing with a sensitive issue, for instance, or if like we have a specific way of referring to something that goes on in the film, then I want to make sure I have the language right. And then I'm not
legal and standards.
Yeah, you don't want to inadvertently just insult somebody or whatever, be insensitive. So it goes through at least the 2, sometimes the 3rd before it goes to the web.
Where did you develop your journalistic chops to write clean and tight?
I came up in digital media, and when you write for digital media, especially, I was at Vox for 8 years, and it was just like a relentless pace. Yeah. It wasn't like working at BuzzFeed. I had, lots of time to sort of, I shouldn't say BuzzFeed, but that kind of like aggregation machine. Mm-hmm. That's not what Vox was when I got there. It's very much just explainer journalism. Mm-hmm. But because the internet has a kind of a gaping maw, which must be fed with content, you just have to learn to write really fast, and you have to learn to write cleanly. And it turns out my years just blogging before that, for fun, because in the aughts, that's what we did for fun.
That was like early boot camp.
Yeah, blogging is really good for writers. Yeah. I'm happy to see the Substack age appear, newsletter age, because that actually is a lot closer to how I started writing. And I think knowing how to write for the public quickly and make sense is like a very underrated skill. Yeah. And if you're a digital person who didn't have the benefit of that many layers of editing, it can come slower.
Yeah. It's interesting, the number one piece of advice that most writers who come on this show give to people who want to be a writer, write novels or anything, is like, you got to write. Just write every day. It could be a letter, a journal, a newsletter, whatever, but just be in the practice of writing regularly.
I agree. And I think the newsletter thing actually is really useful, because it's going to somebody. So somebody's reading it. And that it's like a two-way that you kind of need in order to refine your angle, your way of talking, your voice, all of those things that really certainly in criticism, it's all about the voice.
Have you ever run into someone who you have previously just obliterated in a review, and then you see them out at a whatever, or conversely, someone you've like really praised?
The latter happens a lot, but partly because I write about documentary, and documentarians are just like so happy when anybody's writing about their films. Yeah, I mean, honestly, because it's, you know, it's much harder to make documentary than it is to make narrative film. Yeah, once in a while, I guess I try when I write a pan to be very clear about the reasons I think this is bad and to be very clear about the reasons I think it could be better. And I do think most of the time when I'm just flat out like, well, these people should be ashamed of themselves, it's like a huge studio film. I'm never going to run into, you know, whoever, the head of Disney on the street. They're just not going to care. I have been very aware since joining the Times that, you know, they read my reviews, which they didn't used to. Who's that twerp on the internet? We don't care. The Times is a little different. But even so, it's not like being...
If they know it's happening, they're probably like... get their setup already with their coffee and then just, you know...
Being a movie critic is so much more about thinking about your audience and the viewer of the film. And usually it's the person who saw the movie and now wants to go read the review to like process their feelings. It's very different from being like a theater critic where your review can shut down the show. This is just, you know...
Yeah, it's for the viewer.
Aquaman 2 doesn't care what I think.
For the audience, is there one example of a rave and one example of a pan that you would recommend to them to go Google this review and you get a sense of how I work and how I do reviews?
Yeah, I think... This is not the most recent pan, but the one I wrote last year that I think about was for the Amy Winehouse movie that came out, which was like, it was like a, you know, fictionalized version of Amy Winehouse's life.
Like a docu-series. It's not exactly a documentary. Like
it was not a documentary.
Liberties.
It was a biopic. You know, it was. Yeah. It took some liberties, but it also, and this is something that really bugs me. It clearly showed the involvement of the people who wronged Amy Winehouse and are still alive. Trying
by
to
the way,
kind
I hate that whole genre of like the
I don't like it at
producers
all.
of it are part of the subject. Like if the subject is involved in the making of it, it's just
it's not.
It should almost be.
It should be. Well, I can't say it should be illegal, but you should think very hard about that.
Yeah,
you know,
it's so misleading.
So
things.
I was really upset about that one, and I think if you read the review, you will get that. I do get to write very positive reviews a lot because. I don't know. I see a lot of good movies. I mean, my review of Anora, since that just won Best Picture, I really had a blast writing that. I was so happy to be able to review it because I felt like I had really grasped what the movie was doing, and it mattered to me to get it right.
When you're selecting the ones, is it selected for you, or do you get to?
It's
do you have some say?
A little bit of both.
Do you try to pick ones that you feel optimistic about? Like, I bet I'm going to like this one, so I'll do it.
I try to pick ones that I think I'll have something to say.
Okay.
So sometimes I'm optimistic and sometimes I'm not. But at least I know I'll like have something to hang my hat on.
Yeah.
The most boring review to write is not the pan or the rave, but it's fine. And I write so many of those because that's just most movies.
All right, before we get into We Tell Ourselves Stories, which is terrific, I want to ask you about your previous book, Salty. It's called Salty, Lessons of Eating, Drinking, and Living from Revolutionary Women.
It has a Gibson recipe in it, believe it or not.
Good.
Yeah,
I love eating, drinking, and living, so I do want to know more. It's going to be my next read, but can you tell us a bit about that one?
Yeah, I had so much fun writing it. So it was kind of my pandemic project, my King Lear, as it would. I mean, it's a long story, but I was trying to write a book that I was interested in. I don't know if that, maybe isn't the way people always think about it. And so I structured it as a series of essays about women who I find fascinating, all of whom have passed on. So
it was like Maya Angelou is one, I think.
Maya Angelou, Hannah Arendt, Agnes Varda, Octavia Butler, Ella Baker, who was an amazing civil rights leader, just different women whose lives were interesting to me. And I've always been a person who really likes biography and likes to read about other people's lives. But I wanted to come at it a little differently because, like, these women interest me is not a book. So I thought, well, what if it was about how we can view their ideas about the world through food and drink? And it turned out every one of them had kind of an interesting angle into their life and work through that aspect. A couple of them are food writers, but most of them are not. Most of them are activists or thinkers or artists. And so I wrote kind of a little essay about each of them. There's wonderful illustrations, and there's a recipe at the end of every chapter that corresponds to something about their lives.
I love it. That's my next read. All right, so on to We Tell Ourselves Stories, which is an opening line from one of her essays. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. one of her famous lines that, as you say, is often misinterpreted. It's not really inspiring. It's more about diluting. It's almost like Truman Show is like how we live, telling short stories.
I think it's a diagnostic line. It's at the beginning of the essay, The White Album, which opens the book, The White Album. And that essay is about living through the summer of 1969 in Los Angeles when everything seemed very chaotic and weird and conspiracy theories run rampant and the Manson murders are happening and kind of all of that stuff. And when she writes that, it is a very good encapsulation of what she's getting at through all her work. She's not saying that we should stop telling stories or start telling stories. She's just saying that's what we do as humans. We tell stories in order to make sense of the facts we encounter in the world. Mm-hmm. So when we see a headline, we apply a story to it in order to explain to ourselves why that headline exists. You know, oh, that person had that thing happen to them because they did this bad thing. Mm-hmm. And that's a way of us living with reality, which is like quite scary a lot of the time and chaotic and feels, frightening. And so the stories give us order. And so it's just funny to see. I have a Google alert set for that phrase, just out of curiosity. And almost every time I get an alert, it's from somebody being like, as Joan Didion said, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. So like, let's tell our stories. And I was like, no, that is not what that means. Yeah. But in the case of the title, it felt like it had multiple meanings since it's also a book about Hollywood and America telling itself stories in order to make sense of itself.
It was a fascinating walk through decades of American life as reflected in film. Like the life and art are constantly at play with each other. Yeah. And you'd take us through some event in history and you'd say, and this film came out just at that time, and it was this sort of mirror image in a spooky way often. Yeah, it really is. Yeah, I was inspired by the great film critic Jim Hoberman, who's written several books that are deeper dives into cinema history and American history next to each other. They're like quite intricate and interesting. But the way he does that, I always thought helped me make sense of both the era and the movies. Mm-hmm. And Didion sort of presented herself as the perfect guide through that, through the kind of the American century. Yeah, yeah. And she was a huge fan of John Wayne. She sure was. From her childhood. Mm-hmm. And I guess, got to meet him at one point, which is a fascinating scene in the book. But I was fascinated to see that while she loved John Wayne, she was not as much of a fan of Clint Eastwood. Or maybe it was John Wayne who really was not a fan of Clint Eastwood. John Wayne definitely was not a fan of Clint Eastwood, yeah. I mean, John Wayne was a very traditionalist, he was a very kind of right-wing politically, believed that that Hollywood needed to be promoting traditional American values. He would deny that the blacklist ever happened. That was sort of where he was. Clint Eastwood represented for John Wayne kind of a perversion of that, which is funny because now we think of Eastwood as sort of the inheritor of John Wayne. Yeah. I was shocked to read it that John Wayne sort of frowned upon it. He was like the new guard who was taking darker risks in film as opposed to being this sort of because it's so much about revising Westerns. And John Wayne, I think, really identified with the story of the old Westerns, which was one of heroism and bravery and kind of uncomplicated, expansion west. And when Eastwood started making movies, things shifted a little bit. Not entirely, but, the revisionist Western is as American a genre as the Western, but Wayne is definitely Old school, yeah. I was also surprised to read that Joan Didion was a big fan of Goldwater. Huge. And couldn't stand Reagan. No, or Nixon. I mean, both of those guys were absolutely not. I mean, remember, she's a California girl from Sacramento, and she grew up going to the governor's mansion because those were her friends, were the girls who would be invited to go there. She actually became a Democrat because she was so mad that the California Republican Party embraced Nixon. And then she had no use for Reagan. He's a recurring character in her work as just she's not really worried about his policies, or she's not writing about his policies. She thinks his style, which is drawn from Hollywood, is infecting American politics to a degree that will denigrate politics. That's her view. And she writes about, the mainest thing she ever wrote was a piece called Pretty Nancy, which she wrote in the 60s when the Reagans were in the governor. Well, they weren't in the governor's mansion, but when he was governor. And it is quite mean, and it's a little
profile of Nancy Reagan, and it stuck with Nancy Reagan to the degree that she was still writing about it in her own autobiography decades later.
Wow.
Yeah.
This the power of that Didion pen. By the way, in her young days when she was at Vogue, I was picturing Peggy from Mad Men.
Yes.
I don't know if
Very
that
much.
have you thought of that? Okay.
Yeah, I have. I really think there's a good novel. I mean, it's slightly before Mad Men, so it was mostly the late 50s, but I think there's a good novel in there. Because it was a period of time where someone like Didion, who was obviously a brilliant writer from the start, could write for National Review and The Nation at the same time. And that was not considered odd, whereas today it's hard to imagine anybody managing to pull off getting clips in both publications.
Yeah. One other nice run you have in the book is about Neil Postman's book, We Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yeah.
It's a 1985 book, which is terrific. And it's kind of a small world story for me because when I moved to New York a little more than 25 years ago, I became good friends with Neil's son, Andy Postman.
Oh.
And so I know the book well, and I
Yeah.
know the family well. And so I loved that passage. But Amusing Ourselves to Death. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I bring it up in a chapter where I'm in a passage where we're writing about Reagan and Reagan's kind of interaction with the movies, like the fact that, for instance, the Strategic Defense Initiative was named Star Wars, kind of jokingly, or that Reagan apparently occasionally would say things that people would be like, what is he talking about? And later they'd realize it was from a movie. But Postman has a lot of critiques of Reagan that sound a lot like Didion's critiques of Reagan, which are like kind of all style, no substance. The president goes on his feelings. That was a often leveled critique. And on top of it, Postman attributes it, which Didion does as well, to experiencing politics through television. Television is a context-flattening medium where you might turn on the TV and see a horrible news story and then see a commercial for breakfast cereal, and everything kind of becomes the fog of entertainment. I think we understand this really well now that we have the internet and nothing has context anymore. But both Postman and Didion were writing about that and talking about it specifically in the age of Reagan.
Yeah. It's like Kennedy sort of led the way with TV, and then Reagan was like, actually, now let a pro take over.
Right.
I've been acting for years on how to do
exactly.
this. You also point to a couple inflection points in American culture and then also then reflected in film as almost before and after moments. And one, I think, was Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, which we talked about. But that's sort of like when it was okay for the bad guy to live and get away with it. Like that wasn't done in film prior to then. There were these, what was the name of that sort of standards body that would review?
Oh, right. Yeah, the code, the production code or the Hays Code. Yeah.
And they would review films and make sure, no, you can't have that kind of ending. It has to be this other way.
Yeah, or you couldn't have like a married couple in bed together. You couldn't show a pregnant woman in a movie because that suggested she'd had sex, and that was not allowed with the production code. You could have a baby. You just couldn't have a pregnant woman.
There were that level of oversight. And I guess that was already diminishing a bit by the time Bonnie and Clyde came along, but then that movie just sort of blew the doors off it.
Yeah, it was dying, and 68, I believe, is the year that Jack Valenti took over the MPAA and instituted the rating system. He was like, maybe people can just decide for themselves, and we'll tell them what's in it. It was a little different back then, but yeah, essentially the system we know today.
Okay. And then the other before and after moment that was, I'd never thought about this before, but it makes so much sense now, is 9/11.
Yeah.
And before that, movies were a certain way. But after that, we all needed a hero. We needed a savior, this 9/11 catastrophe. And the films after that, that was sort of the birth of our Marvel universe and the superhero movies and Spider-Man and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, most of us watched 9/11 happen on television. And even if we were near it, we have repeatedly seen it on television since. So the iconography of 9/11 sort of is the reality for most people. And people will say, where were you when it happened? You're remembering an image on television. And you see that image actually repeat itself through movies even before kind of Marvel got going. We had these Spider-Man movies that were big at the time. And over time, you see some of the falling and the buildings and the rescuing by a superhero who's kind of impervious to the damage becomes bigger and bigger and bigger for us, to the point where we have, I think, Marvel movies now are basically incoherent politically, but they always have this theme of the world is ending and the good guy has to come save us. And I thought that was fascinating. And it was also fascinating to me that, Didion didn't really write about that, but she did write a lot about what was going on in the culture at the time. And that's the period where her husband died and then her daughter died a couple years afterwards, and she's thinking about safety, security, being rescued. What are the stories that she's told herself that kept her secure and that now she kind of has to let go of?
It's, I love history, and I'm always trying to get my kids to love history.
Yeah.
And it's hard to take a textbook of history of fact after fact, but this is such a relatable way to go through it because you see the events in history and then you get to experience it through film. It's like, and then you see, oh my gosh, I see that craving in the audience that they were looking to fill with this film and how it all, I just had a number of aha moments. I'm like, oh my gosh, now I see why that film worked at that time.
Yeah, me too, honestly. I mean, I was in college when 9/11 happened, and then I've been a critic through the Marvel age. But just going back and looking at how Hollywood and American history have tracked one another over time and how you can see changes. Actually, Hollywood generally lags changes a little bit in the American culture, but you can kind of see the shifts and changes over time, not just in the stories, like the literal stories that are being told, but the way they're told, who's telling them, who's allowed to tell them, what kind of voices are appearing in the mainstream. And we were talking about the Oscars, but the last 10 years of the Oscars really tell a story about who gets to tell stories in Hollywood. And I think that is really interesting to look at. So
this is your point, the more international
voting
community and
more adventurous, less tied to convention, I think. I mean, you get movies like Moonlight or Parasite or, just those kinds of movies that were very popular with the audiences who eventually saw them, even if they were smaller. But I think also because the movies have generally been smaller over the past 10 years or so that have won Oscars or won Best Picture, I think it tells us something about how the way we view media has changed, which is that there isn't a monolith, there isn't a monoculture. And I do miss the monoculture. It would make my job easier. But it also means that there's more... I always think about that metaphor of describing reality where it's like the group of blind philosophers happen on the elephant in the woods and they all need to describe what it is that they've run into and they each start touching it. And one says, oh, it's the trunk of a tree. And one of them says, oh, it feels like a brush or it's like a large snake. And they're all describing the part of reality that they can see at that moment. And I think artists are doing that. They're describing the reality they see. So the more people are describing, the better view of reality we're going to get.
We'll get the whole elephant pretty soon.
That's right. Well, let's hope so. I mean, we'll see.
All right. Before I ask you what's next, I wanted to get your thoughts on a headline I saw recently about Joan Didion, which I'm sure you've seen this, about her notes from her therapy session.
Yes.
And somehow the estate, these things have leaked out and they're going to publish them. What are your thoughts about that? It seems very invasive to me.
I mean... the people who are doing it are the people who sort of are the trustees of her estate. So we can set it up for the audience. I just want to make sure people understand, because only you and I and a couple other nerds have seen this headline, but she had years and years of therapy sessions. I think she took her own personal notes about them. Kind of in the late 90s and the early aughts, and she wrote them as letters to her husband who passed away in 2003, so he was still alive then. And he was, the two of them were partners in every sense of the word. I think they worked together. They edited one another. They were, even when they were writing things that weren't so nice about one another, they would edit one another's work. And so he was sort of the other half of her brain, I think. So this could not be of a more personal nature. I mean, that's about as personal as it gets. Yeah. The estate somehow has discovered a box of these things and now wants to... Typed, which led to the idea... I mean, I can't pass judgment on this, but led to the idea that she intended for them to be found and published at some point. And it's kind of interesting because it fits into the kind of publishing that has happened from her work basically since she stopped writing new work. She wasn't very well for the last 10 years of her life. So, for instance, the book South and West is her journals, reporting journals from trips she took in the 70s. But she was alive when that was published. I don't know. I wouldn't want them published. Have you had an early look? No. In fact, they're embargoed right now because the New York Public Library is releasing her. They've been processing and are getting ready to release her archives and John's archives. So those... I believe it's embargoed until at least that happens at the end of March. Okay. And there's a lot of very personal stuff in those archives. I am led to understand it. I haven't seen that either. Like letters and journals and things like that. Yeah. So it's interesting. I I can't possibly say if she did or didn't intend for them to be published. I do know she didn't love the idea of posthumous publishing for other authors, but I think what it is evidence of is that there's a lot of hunger for Didion stuff in the world. I mean, hopefully that works out for me.
And this will help address it. Exactly. We tell ourselves stories.
Yes.
This is.
But there's a lot left to say about her, I think, too. Yeah. So, yeah.
I mean, we could go on about her work. Your book doesn't get too much into all of the other stuff. It's a great examination through film of everything we've discussed. But like with her novels, so thinly veiled of characters in her lives, everyone sort of jokes like, oh, if you know an author, you're going to show up in one of their books. It's like, you definitely are with her. Like,
very much. I mean, there is one of her novels is narrated by a character named Joan Didion, who is not her, but is basically her. I mean, John Wayne kind of shows up veiled a couple times in different novels.
Her lover,
husband, yes.
The lover who she really loves more than her husband.
Well,
it's like, oh my God.
Debatable, but yes, there's just like all these different characters. And also a lot of her biography pops up. I would really recommend people read Run River, which she didn't seem to like very much. It was her first book that was published. She wrote it in her late 20s. Mm-hmm. But it's basically the best account of how she felt about California in her youth. Mm-hmm. And also the characters are constantly doing things that she did as a child, like playing Donner Party. That was their favorite make-believe. And she definitely did the same thing as a kid.
Well, before we get into lightning round, what's next for you? Working on another book? More
I
reviews?
have some thoughts, but they're nowhere near like cohesive. A lot of my life is just writing for the Times.
What's your next movie review assignment?
Oh goodness, that's a great question. I just filed a column on a documentary called Housewife of the Year that's coming out, and it was actually really fascinating. It's about a live televised competition called Housewife of the Year that happened in Ireland from the 60s to the 90s. So that'll be playing somewhere. You can see that. Yeah, I think this year a lot of my focus is on AI in Hollywood and its potential effects, how we should be thinking about it.
Mostly in terms of the visual experience or in terms of the writing and the script?
Writing, script, effects, everything. I mean, I think there's a lot of pieces there, and I don't see a lot of rigorous thinking out there about it. And because my background is in technology, I feel a little more equipped to maybe address it than other people have. So I don't know. It's something I care about a lot, and I think there's a lot of angles that remain unexamined.
Well, I love the idea of you running around the city in these cool little screening rooms. Do you get popcorn in the screening rooms?
No. Usually you can't do anything. Like you're
BYO?
lucky. No, a lot of them, like you kind of have to sneak in your brownie or whatever you're eating between. I do eat a lot of popcorn. I have very strong opinions about the popcorn at the various theaters in New York.
Who's number one popcorn in the city?
Film Forum.
All right. Where is that one?
That is on Houston Street.
Oh, down. Yeah, I know that one. Mm-hmm. It's Angelica, right?
No. So the Angelica is like Broadway Lafayette area. This one is this is much older theater, nonprofit theater on Houston and gosh, what is that? It's right on top of the Houston One Stop. Yeah.
Is the Angelica still around? I haven't been.
The Angelica is still around. Yep. And IFC is still around, and then Metrograph. So those are kind of the downtown theaters. But Film Forum has knocked it out of the park for a long time.
Oh, I love it. All right. Okay, so on to the lightning round.
Yes.
For Alyssa, by the way, thank you.
Of course.
Again, for the Gibson idea.
Thank you.
I'm going to be having more of these.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the ingredients, so.
Okay, your favorite book as a kid?
This is so basic, but Anne of Green Gables is the first one that springs to mind. And all the Anne books, but certainly the first one. Yeah.
Great. Book or books you're reading now?
So I am reading Carrie... I still don't know how to pronounce her. Carrie Kurojan's book, Miss May Does Not Exist, which is about Elaine May. Carrie and I are doing a panel together at the Albany Film Festival at the end of the month. But also this book is so good. And Joan and Elaine were friends. So I'm excited to finish reading it. I'm loving it. And then
how fun is it to go home, by the way, to do a festival like that in Albany?
It's something. It's weird. It's great. Actually, my family gets to go and hear me do my thing. I don't think they always know what I do with my life otherwise. So yeah.
That's great. Sorry, was there another one you're reading now?
Oh, I'm reading some of John Berger's Ways of Seeing again because I'm teaching it to my class at NYU in the next couple weeks. So,
what's the class that you teach there?
I teach in a interdisciplinary master's program there, and I'm teaching a creative nonfiction course on attention and creative nonfiction writing.
Great.
Yeah.
Is this like a seminar or?
No,
bigger?
it's actually in the master's program I graduated from 15 years ago, which is called Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a group of students from all different programs across the university. Just
Do you love it?
I do. I taught for.
You stress me out to be a teacher.
Oh, I taught undergrads for 14 years, so this is actually my first semester as a graduate professor, and it's just so much better.
Easier? Okay.
Oh my gosh!
Like
I mean,
they actually want to be there.
yeah, they're better writers too.
Okay.
Yeah, generally, which you would hope by the time you're 23 or whatever, you've had some life experience.
Yeah.
But with, I loved my undergrads. That was my whole life for a long time. But graduate students is a whole different ballgame. I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
All right, your favorite movie as a kid?
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Jimmy Stewart?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great one.
I think I saw that movie like 50 times conservatively. And I only recently found out that Frank Capra got in real hot water with Congress over it.
Why?
Yeah, they didn't like it.
Just the depiction of Capitol Hill and all
I
that?
guess so. Yeah. I mean, it was considered kind of progressive or
It
something.
passed the standards, right?
Yeah, it was
Before
very
67.
strange. Yeah, I was like, this seems like a very American movie to me. But yeah, I think that movie actually shaped my political consciousness in ways I'm still finding out.
Oh, that's funny. I'll have to go back and rewatch it.
It's very
They might
good.
have given him a hard time, but probably not Jimmy Stewart. Everybody loves that guy.
He's very young. It's like very early in his career. I'm not sure that people really. I think Jean Arthur also is in it. Yeah, it's a great one.
I'll go back.
Yeah.
Let's see. Top few movies pre 9/11, top few post 9/11.
Okay, so forgive me, I made notes on this. So one would be Joan Didion, which was declared the best movie of all time by a poll of film critics and filmmakers a couple years ago, which is Chantal Akerman's like 4-hour-long film about a woman who's just like doing daily tasks, but then has this crazy twist at the end. Great movie. Everybody should see it. But one that sprung to mind was Primary. Do you know this film? So Robert Drew and Associates, which was like his group, including D.A. Pennebaker, made this. It's basically the first observational documentary where they followed Kennedy around during his presidential campaign. And you watch it, you see kind of the unfiltered Kennedy. It's so good. Everyone should watch it if you can get your hands on it.
What does it reveal to you about Kennedy unfiltered?
You just get to see his charisma. I think like I know he's charismatic, right? But like at this point, all of our politicians are somewhat edited for charisma.
Yeah.
They have to have some kind of an appeal on TV. But Kennedy's kind of the first TV president. And so you see him next to Humphrey, who's just like boring to watch on TV. And you're like, oh, of course he won, and he's obviously good at what he's doing. But it's a really fascinating look at a moment where television became important.
Yeah.
In American politics.
Primary.
Okay. Yeah, it's terrific. And then after 9/11, I just wanted to flag, actually, I mean, one of them is Nickel Boys, I would say, which was up for Best Picture.
Book.
Yeah, so Best Picture nominee this past Oscars. It is genuinely one of the most radical and also watchable movies that I've seen in all my time being a critic. I would very much recommend people seek it out.
They made Underground Railroad into a film too, right?
They did, yeah. Colson Whitehead writes things that make for for a good screen. Yeah. But I will say Nickel Boys, while it tells the same story quite faithfully as the novel, the movie is mainly shot in like first person. So it's from the point of view of two of the characters. So it's almost a radical reinterpretation of the story that's being told into a screen medium.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
The actor today that you think Didion would most closely identify with her hero, John Wayne.
I thought about this for a long time, and I think that for her, John Wayne represented a kind of safety. That was what she loved about him, is he seemed like a secure, safe person. And so I was
Nothing's going to happen on my watch.
Yeah. So I was trying to think about who would have been that. And what sprung to mind, and then I realized it was actually kind of John Wayne related, was Jeff Bridges in True Grit specifically. Just has that kind of presence, I think, of like he shows up and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be okay.
So True Grit was originally a John Wayne movie?
I believe, yeah.
And then Bridges redid it?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the Coen Brothers version 5 or 6 years ago. There are probably better answers, but I think maybe the mood that she seems to have ascribed to seeing John Wayne is what I ascribe to seeing him. Yeah. I think that's right.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. The politician she would most closely identify with Goldwater, which was her favorite politician.
Okay, so I really don't have a perfect answer for this because I don't think we turn out Goldwaters anymore, but I would put at least a little bit of money on Tim Walz. So the reason is,
I think,
yes. So again, like she did like Goldwater's policies, obviously, but I do think she responded to Goldwater in part because of his kind of no nonsense, say it as it is, like show up and seem like a man who like has walked around in the world kind of. He doesn't seem like a product of Hollywood, even though he was known for being quite handsome and looking like a cowboy and all of that. Waltz doesn't look like a cowboy, but he has that quality when he shows up where you're just like, oh, he's just like telling me stuff. And I've been watching, I mean, during the campaign, I would look at Instagram and he'd show up on somebody's radio program and he could just talk about like putting a new roof on your house or like some kind of a burger he really likes. And I thought, I kind of think that's part of what she found appealing is it just doesn't feel like acting.
Yeah, just
yeah.
Stuff. Okay.
Yeah, even though I'm sure he has excellent media training because he is really good at it.
Last question for Alissa Wilkinson. One piece of advice for the audience.
I'm going to give 1.5. The half is try gin in your Bloody Mary.
Oh.
Yeah. You say
is there
that
a different name for that?
There is technically, but they don't know. It's a red snapper. But if you say this to a bartender, they'll look at you and then their eyebrows will go up and they'll go, oh, it's a good idea. So try gin in your Bloody Mary. But I would also say Didion themed. I would recommend everyone read her 2003 book, Where I Was From, which is about her rethinking the myths that she inherited about California from her family and also rethinking them as an adult. I think for me, it was a book that gave me permission to rethink stories that I had believed. And I think it's a remarkable book, but I think it's really helpful for anyone who finds themselves continually reevaluating the mythologies that they were handed, which I think a lot of people are doing right now. So Where I Was From is a banger, as they say.
I'll check it out. Didion never showed up much on my high school English curriculum, and so I'm behind on reading some of her stuff, but I do have a Book of Common Prayer on my desk. So I'm going to get to that next, and then I'll try that one after that.
Yep.
After I read Salty.
That's right. That one will be a nice, pleasant, hopefully.
Totally. As this was.
Well, thank you.
What a pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye.